a condition of participation for CMS to finalize that rule. So that rule is under consideration. I think a week or so ago, it was sort of continued for another year, but we're very, very hopeful that that will be finalized. The Joint Commission has mandated that, so all Joint Commission hospitals have to have stewardship programs, and we've seen great increase across the country in the presence of stewardship programs, and it's making a difference. We need to see more. We also have stewardship needs in the outpatient arena, and the CMS has a condition of participation for long-term care facilities, which are real breeding grounds for antibiotic resistance. So those are a couple of high-level thoughts in terms of where we are.
Well, let me ask you about the pipeline for antibiotics, because that has to be part of the answer here, right? You mentioned how even the 42 or 46 that are in development now, a very small number of those might address our needs. How do we incentivize that? How do we, on our end, incentivize the research and development that needs to happen?
Great question. So it is true that the antibiotic pipeline is thin, and we've been making efforts for the last at least 10 years to work on resurrecting it a little bit. And while we had a little bit of good news and a few more antibiotics approved recently, we have this sort of terrible situation where the market really seems to be broken, and we had the bankruptcy of a company. So we're finding that the return on investment for antibiotics is just not what it needs to be. And some of the reasons are that antibiotics are given for short periods of time. We hold them, people like me, hold them as much as possible to be used only when we need them for the worst infections. And, the societal sort of standards are that the cost is just not that high. So we unfortunately have come to the point where this company who developed an antibiotic that we really needed couldn't even afford to continue to manufacture it so we could have it on the shelf in our pharmacy for the time we need it. So that gets to incentives. And so we sort of break down incentives into two groups. Push incentives are those that happen before the drug is FDA approved, and we have a good example, I think, in CARB-X, which is a public-private partnership between BARDA and several other global partners, including the Wellcome Trust and some other academic and government groups. They have successfully funded a number that at the end of this year it'll be over 60 different medicines and diagnostics for antibiotic-resistant infections, and that's really great, and that's helping that early phase. The other sort of part of the story are so-called pull incentives, which cover the time after a drug is approved by the FDA, and that's the area where we're seeing this big problem now with the bankruptcy and maybe some more. Yeah. And so there is where this Disarm Act comes in, and that's one idea of a pull incentive to carve out the cost of the new antibiotic from the diagnosis-related group, the kind of bundle payment that we get in the hospital, and could be a kind of short-term, small step in the right direction. Very importantly, that incentive is tied directly to antibiotic stewardship, so it has to be used in hospitals that have antibiotic stewardship programs, and takes it one step further to actually requiring reporting on use of antibiotics back to the CDC, so that we'll know that these drugs that are incentivized are used in the best way possible. Yeah. Another sort of, we know that more is going to be needed in the pull side, and so the concept of delinkage, that is taking the return on investment away from the volume of sales, this concept has really gained traction in ideas like a market entry reward that might be awarded to the maker of a drug that targets a really great unmet need at the time of licensing and guarantees a certain amount of return on investment over a period of, say, 5 years, again, tied to good stewardship and appropriate use, could be enough to kind of help get this
prime the pump.
Get us back into a functional situation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dallas, let's just the biodefense preparedness and then the defense management. How is that best coordinated on a local or state level?
The best thing for them to respond, and first, we've made a lot of progress. Exercises help a great deal. The one gap, I'd like to go back to gaps, how do we improve further? It's getting the physicians to come. We have, it's hard to get them, they're busy. To get them involved in the exercises is a key factor for us. I think the key to that is through the CEOs of the hospitals. They can tell them what to do, and if they did, that would help a great deal. Like I said before, the infrastructure support I didn't even mention it, but these things that make everything worse, the cyber vulnerability of the healthcare system is stunning. Just there in our local vicinity there in your district, there have been a bunch of ransomware attacks that have taken down these healthcare institutions for millions of dollars. And all of this robs the infrastructure. So I would say bolstering the public health infrastructure is the answer to this. And so that when it occurs, and I believe, and I agree with my colleagues here that this is coming, when you say something's, we were talking about it before, when you say something's a low likelihood event, that just, it's not a straight line that we're talking about. It's low likelihood, and then all of a sudden, you're logarithmic. And,
Right.
And you're shooting up.
Yeah, when it happens, you got to be prepared
Yeah,
at that point.
you gotta be ready.
And you mentioned the healthcare coalitions. I'm curious about that, and in reference to what you're talking about now with the exercises. I'm assuming that means not just the hospitals and doctors, but
Right.
the entire healthcare coalition that you're talking about, which would include law enforcement and a host of others involved. Is that?
That's right, like volunteer groups, and how to mobilize people. They can't show up at the time and help. We have to have trained people. Medical Reserve Corps units. There are all sorts of ways, but it's got to be the community working together. New York showed us the way on this, and it was really phenomenal because it's a false multiplier of all your resources there working together. We've seen, I saw it in Georgia just over the last 10 years. It's just, it really explodes the capabilities. But in the end, if we don't have the drugs, if we don't have the new antibiotics, I'll add to the testimony that was just said, we have a drug development is pretty big at the University of Georgia, and yet we're now telling the students coming up that the odds of you running a drug all the way through the system is 10%. And so these youngsters, they all look young to me now, they're coming up and they're going, I'm never going to run a drug through. And so there's just a lot of disincentivization with that, and that's a major issue. So on the pharmaceutical end, we got to fix it. On the healthcare coalition, we got to continue to build it, particularly the weak links like the nursing homes and assisted living facilities and the power backup.
And in addition to that, I would think there would have to be a partnership between federal, state, and local. I mean, this is everyone working together.
Like we say, all disasters are local, and we sure appreciate the federal government's support because the resources are massive and awesome and really impressive. Although some of them, like you were describing, haven't been very efficient. But when it comes to being on the local level, it's all local, and we have to depend that they can meet these demands at the local level.
All right, Mr. Curry, let me ask you real quickly. I'm sure all of you are aware that DHS has determined that fentanyl poses a significant material threat to our security. Do you agree with that assessment, by the way?
Yes, sir.
All of you, I'm assuming, agree with that. So can something like fentanyl be used as a broader mass attack on the U.S.?
Sir, I think, I'm not sure I'd be comfortable answering that in a public setting. We're not actually doing any work on that specifically, but the issue of fentanyl as a drug and some of the drug concerns versus its use as a weapon of mass destruction, those are kind of two separate issues, and the latter gets into classified information pretty quickly.
Okay, totally respect that. My last question for now, Dr. George, you mentioned the blueprint with 33 recommendations. Who has received those 30 recommendations, and ultimately, who's responsible to implement them?
So we had distributed the report throughout Congress. We issued it in 2015, though, so it's been a while. We wrote recommendations for various federal entities, for the administration, meaning the White House specifically, and for Congress to execute. So it depends on the recommendation. But you know, sir, it depends on what the topic is too. I don't think we should be leaving it to just one entity. All by themselves. If the White House isn't going to pick up on something, Congress certainly should. If Congress isn't going to pick up on something, then the rest of the federal government can. You know, it's one of the beautiful things about our government. So that would be my...
As one of the messy things about our government, like you said, Mr. Curry, we've got like 12 different overlapping, nobody knows who's in charge, and it seems like this is something that needs to be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, let me stay with you, Dr. George. I know that most nations, almost all, have signed this, biological weapons convention, basically a treaty not to purchase these agents. However, it's a different story with some of these non-state actors, and the technology has really come down in terms of the cost of acquiring it or developing it yourself. What level of risk do you think that our military face? Say, we got folks in Syria, we got folks in Afghanistan, Iraq. What's the level of risk do you think that is presented for them to face what you faced in uniform?
Yes, sir. I of course think it depends on the geographic area that they're located in, but I think that they're at great risk. I think these countries and our troops and everybody else's troops are at enormous risk. When you look at Syria, for example, Syria had a vibrant biological weapons program.
Yeah.
North Korea is suspected of engaging in biological weapons development as well. And Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and other terrorist organizations have been very vocal about their desire to obtain or produce and use biological weapons. And they're not talking about doing that out in the country somewhere where nobody is. You have to take their desires to use biological weapons and look at who they're fighting at the same time. That puts those populations at risk, and it puts our troops at risk as well.
Let me ask, Mr. Curry, and also Dr. Dallas. So the response in its initial phase will be local. So that means my local community health center in my neighborhood. In a lot of rural communities, it's probably a local community health center. It's our docs and nurses, EMS, first responders. That's the front line of the program we have right now. And so how do we engineer our response so that we push out some of the countermeasures to that population, to our first responders, to our local health centers, to the people that are going to have to respond to this in the first instance?
Well, I think one thing I'd like to say, this is where I think health situational awareness becomes so important. So you're right, the nurses and docs are the ones that are going to see the information the fastest and right away. But at the federal level, this is why these information networks that DHS and HHS have been developing are so critical, because the idea is that we need to have them tied into all the state and local information to get that information as quick as possible, not just to diagnose it and understand what's going on, but then quickly communicate to everybody at all those levels that need to come in and help surge and respond. Yeah. Otherwise, it's going to remain localized for a long period of time before the word trickles up to whoever it needs to trickle up to, and then trickles down very slowly. And that's our concern about the lack of progress on these situational awareness networks.
So, Dr. Boucher, you're at Tufts, and we have an event like this, and as Dr. Dallas points out, and Mr. Curry, the initial impact is really on the street level. How well are we equipped to connect what you're doing and the resources that you have, and are there exercises that go on here that we coordinate, the local community health center with Tufts or your research arm and the labs that are working on this?
Well, I guess I can speak to what happens at the hospital. So we certainly have exercises that are ongoing, and we work with the city and state Department of Public Health, which are tied into CDC. So I think we learned a lot from the Ebola experience, and it wasn't smooth when it started, but certainly I think that we have these tabletop exercises regularly, and there's participation with community partners as well as a hospital like ours. We're a quaternary referral center, but we also communicate across town, and we have different, lots of different players in the medical world, but the state and local health departments really are the center and do a great job. And so both in sort of this really kind of dreaded disaster preparedness, but also in things like the opioid epidemic. You know, we're working together in that way too. So I think that that's the vision from our CDC colleagues, is that it works local, state, health departments up to CDC and back,
Yeah.
for at least for surveillance and initial response in that regard.
Can you comment on that? I mean, your initial testimony, I meant to go back to that, where you talked about, repeat opioid use, contributes to this vulnerability of antimicrobial resistance. What's the connection there? I missed that.
Okay, so people who inject opioids get infections because they're injecting through their skin.
Yeah.
Even if their skin was clean, they'd have an increased risk of infection. We know that patients who use opioids have a 16 times higher risk of having an MRSA infection, which is a resistant kind of bacterial infection. And so what we're seeing are patients like this, unfortunately.
Is that shared needles? Is that?
It's not even. I mean, it could be. It could be worse with shared needles, but just injecting, every time you injecting your skin,
Okay.
even if it's sterile, there's still a risk, right? The skin is our most important barrier to infection.
Right.
So these people are injecting over and over again, usually not in such a sterile way. So, but we know from good studies that these patients have a 16-fold higher risk of MRSA, and that's just one kind of resistant bacteria. But our hospitals are full of these patients, and treating them is incredibly difficult. It's heart-wrenching. These are young, otherwise healthy people. We're talking about doing a heart valve replacement and another one and another one. I mean, it's incredible, the burden of that morbidity and mortality that we see. And so our society now has a whole group dedicated to infections in people who inject drugs because it's such a big problem. It's almost a little bit like the beginning of the AIDS epidemic in terms of what we're seeing and the burden of it, the stigma of it, and the challenges, the sort of multidisciplinary challenges in treating it.
That's great. All right. I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. George, I know the Blue Ribbon panel has had some meetings and has published some stuff involving the private sector being involved in the preparedness efforts, similar to what Dr. Dallas was talking about. Just comment a little bit of how the partnership works between the private sector and government.
So it depends, of course, on the topic, I guess. And I know I keep saying that it depends.
Just an example.
Well, I think when it comes to pharmaceutical development, for example, the federal government has identified various threats, various biological threats that we would need antibiotics and other antimicrobials to address. And they need to fund those things that we don't have a market for. So that would be on the one hand. On the other hand, the United States government is not in the business of producing antimicrobials by itself, so it has to work with the private sector. And together they have to produce what is needed for the country.
Okay, so in that scenario, you're talking private sector would be the corporate, the business sector.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Coming back, Dr. Dallas, to you, the national biodefense structure that the president has come out with, do you see a pathway in that for better collaboration between federal government, federal agencies, and state and local?
Yeah, like was said earlier, it was a good start, and it was a long time coming, but it is a good start, and I'm encouraged by it, frankly. We've got to do something to get to bolster this the private sector's incentivizations. For instance, the vaccine development is a perfect example. We've almost chased the vaccine development out of the country, even when we provide incentivizations to these companies. Oh, you know what their main objection? Lawsuits. They said, look, we can't, we can make Tylenol or some other agent and make lots of money. The liability here is too high. And say, well, we'll protect you. And they say, I don't believe you. and they've just withdrawn, even when offered what they say is legal protections. Yeah, I am encouraged by the new device. I'd like to see it move forward. Like was said in other testimonies here, there's often some real latent periods. Some of them go on a long time before we see a response. But yes, I am encouraged by it. Okay. I would really like to see us incentivize these companies to move forward, and I mean right away.
Good suggestion. All right, I want to come back to earlier, you mentioned one of the things that you didn't phrase it this way, but keeps you up at night is the vulnerabilities that we have, in particular with the elderly senior community. All right, so we've got all these facilities out here. We've got hundreds of thousands, millions of seniors living in them, and private homes, a host of different places. What's needed to bring these facilities up to standard? I mean, it sounds like an enormous task.
It helps that most of these facilities have isolation capabilities now, okay? It's just that they're operating on the edge. They're operating in a margin, and they don't have the incentives either to further develop these isolation capabilities. So we ought to take the isolation capabilities we have now and exercise them. And otherwise, what we'll end up doing is if they get to the hospital, they'll get care. If they don't, they won't get care.
All right, before you go
it's really
further,
dangerous.
For my help, all right, what are we talking about with isolation capabilities?
Well, that usually means they're laughing over here with me. It usually means we have a little room, we stick them off.
All right, that's what I had pictured in my mind.
And we have a $10 an hour person that has no training that is expected to keep them from infecting the other people, and they don't succeed, and then it spreads, and then we can't move them, because if we move them, we'll then contaminate the bus driver and the personnel. So yeah, it's to take that simplistic, very basic, almost 19th century, I shouldn't have said that, but system that we have and advance it. Just let's bring it up to the 21st
Yeah, I
century.
mean, and that's got to be an enormous thing. I'm thinking a little room as well. If you've got an entire facility, a senior citizen facility where you've got something spreading, they're not going to all fit in one room. I mean, this is yet another disaster waiting to happen.
And the rural areas are where the real issues are, because they're on the edge. These are the vulnerable people. They're already on the edge, I mean, frankly, on the edge of healthcare access. And boy, when this comes, it's going to hit them the hardest because they're on the edge. And then, like Mr. Curry was just saying, we're the frontline people, and we're showing this information. We can't really tell what's going on. We've got to have a central, organizing people to say, look, there's the problem, and then they come back and tell us what to do. But I'm telling you, these nursing home and assisted living facilities, particularly the ones that are on the edge now, there's where things are going to explode out of there on us.
Well, we'd appreciate if you'd fix that problem real quickly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll do our best.
All right. I mean, that goes back to my question regarding the community health centers, because I know a lot of rural communities love their community health centers, but I'm not sure that anybody on the ground within that health center is thinking about this problem. And I'm not sure we've incentivized them to do that.
We have a lot of highly motivated people in public health departments, and people forget about them. And they're really motivated. They're just do-gooders par excellence.
They are.
But they don't have the knowledge. Somebody at the central level has got to shoot information back to them, say, you've got to watch, you've got to isolate, or you've got to move them out.
Yeah.
They got to be told, and then somebody better get down there to help them, and we're going to have to force them to have evacuation plans.
Yeah.
And then back them up.
I actually, so we had a suicide cluster in my neighborhood, my local neighborhood. We lost 14 young boys over about 18 months. And it was my local health center. It was the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And then we reached out to CDC in Atlanta. And so it was that whole network, sort of what you're describing, for a different type of problem, but it was very much a scramble until we got the right people in place and had an opportunity to address it. I want to ask each of you, so you each got about a minute and 15 seconds. What else do you think is important for the ranking member and I to know, and members of the committee to know? What else do you think is very important for us to understand? I mean, we have your written statements, so I know you've got your top 5 ideas, but what else is out there do you think is lacking that we might need to address, or something that might not have percolated up in our discussion already today? Dr. Boucher.
Thank you very much. I'll comment on a couple of things quickly. We didn't really hit that much on diagnostics, but an area where we really are on the edge, I think, of making some big advances are on diagnostic tests. So that's an ability to know if a patient has a virus or a bacteria causing their infection, or if it's a bacteria, which bacteria. If we knew that, we could impact this problem of resistance, we believe, in a really meaningful way. And so there are efforts going on in that public-private partnership I mentioned is funding some diagnostic companies, but there's still work to do on the path to approval and marketing and using them in our hospitals. Another area that I don't think we probably highlighted enough was the One Health approach. So we understand that the problem of antibiotic resistance really flows between humans, animals, and the environment. And we in the United States have made some good progress with our food animals, with the veterinary feed directive that was passed, sort of banning the use of antibiotics as growth promoters in food animals. But this problem on a global scale is huge. The amount of people in the world who are going to be eating meat is going up and up and up. And we know that a lot of resistance comes from the developing world to us. So this interrelationship is very important in the way we address this problem. And this is something that we're focused on in our center in terms of research. We're studying things like passing of resistance from your pet dog or cat to the family and back and forth. And there are a number of issues here, as well as in the environment. So I think we want to highlight that. And then the last thing I'll mention is the workforce. We need a robust workforce to solve this problem. We need doctors, of course, which is my bias, but also we need nurses and pharmacists and others. So we at IDSA and others are highly engaged in things that will help us recruit and retain the best and the brightest in this field and ensure that they're remunerated adequately to stay in the field. So thank you.
Excellent. Dr. George.
Sir, I would just mention two things in particular. We talked about information flow earlier. I think it's important for you to realize that there's an intelligence issue here as well. The intelligence community has not dedicated a whole lot of resources to this particular threat since we shut down our own offensive biological weapons program back in the 70s. They have to step up, but we're talking about diseases and activities that are occurring on the non-classified side as well. So that information intelligence fusion has to happen, and then information has to go up and down so that it's usable by state and local folks. I would also mention, too, that it's important for you to know, if you didn't already, that the public is actually very concerned about the biological threat. One of the reasons is almost everybody's had some issue with antimicrobial resistance, of course, but many know people who have received white powder letters and packages. And also, I think it's important to understand that Hollywood has picked up on this, and they keep churning out these movies that put the biological threat front and center to the public and keeps it on their minds. So we owe it to the constituents to actually do something about this and move the the stick forward so that they feel better protected.
Very good. Mr. Curry.
Yes, sir. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just limit it to
No, you got time.
Okay, I have two things. So the first thing I'll say, just for you as the chairman and the ranking member, you mentioned congressional oversight. I think Dr. George mentioned congressional oversight. We think the strategy, we're looking at it right now. We're going to report on it later this year. I think it is one of the best efforts we've seen so far, and we've been looking at this for a long time to better coordinate biodefense. But consistent oversight is going to be critical to keep this moving forward. We see across government, we look at everything there is in government at GAO, and where there is heavy oversight and heavy emphasis, progress gets made. And I think the execution of the strategy is going to be critical. And there's going to be some really difficult things in that execution. I mentioned the prioritization of resources and budgets across so many departments. It's going to be a huge challenge to be able to look at that holistically.
Mr. Curry, you're actually, isn't the GAO currently reviewing the report that Dr. George referred to earlier?
Yes, sir. We're currently reviewing the National Biodefense Strategy to both ensure that it met the legislative requirements and also to see if it's going to be successful when it's implemented.
Okay.
And so that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is that it's got to be successful in the execution, but it's going to be a major challenge, and it's not going to get implemented successfully just by the departments without consistent congressional oversight.
Excellent. All right. Is that all you got?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Dr. Dallas?
Yeah, I want to jump right on that along with Mr. Curry. He mentioned about congressional oversight. I'll give you a perfect example. And the progress that we made in Georgia, you know, we had this influx of Ebola patients coming in. The way we were able to make progress was because there was congressional oversight language that we could get back to that controlled how the Ebola funding was done. Now, as we all know in here, you know, when there's government appropriations, people want to send it off in all sorts of directions. But since there was very firm congressional oversight language, it really made a path for us. And that is probably more than any other single factor, other than our enthusiasm and running around in back of ambulances, was the fact that there was congressional, and every time we got lip service. No, the congressional language says this. And then that made us, and that's what I saw in person. That's how we made the progress we did.
I do know that on the Ebola issue, that we had asked a certain number of institutions to raise their hand and say, if we're in this situation, we're in. Yeah. And so, you know, to those courageous institutions that volunteered their services and said, you know, we want to be part of this and we want to step up. The only problem was when it did happen, many were unprepared. They were very willing, yep, but they were woefully unprepared. And so that's sort of the gap between where we want to be and where we actually are. I also have I'll get some housekeeping here. Do you have? Yeah, absolutely. Go right ahead. I yield to the gentleman for 5 minutes.
No, I won't need 5 minutes. Dr. Boucher, I just have not been able to ask you a question. And I guess the one that I have remaining for you is how can we reduce the rate of unnecessary prescribed antibiotics?
That's a great question. So we believe that there are a number of ways to do this. And so antibiotic stewardship, this programmatic approach to the most optimal use of antibiotics is a great way. And it involves, you know, a program that exists in a hospital or healthcare system to ensure that antibiotics are used appropriately, that is, not used when they're not needed, and used in the best way possible when they're needed. And that's really important because using them in the best way has better outcomes. We have learned a lot, I would say, in the first 5 years of the National Action Plan about what impacts behavior, why physicians give antibiotics to people with colds. We've learned that good studies have shown that if a patient comes into the doctor's office late in the day, they're more likely to get an antibiotic than if they come early in the day. You know, there are a lot of issues at play. And so actually we've recommended at the Presidential Advisory Council more work on implementation science. How do you actually get it to happen? How do you get people to change their behavior? And I think we're making strides. There's been some good progress in pediatrics. There was just a study this week about emergency rooms, having stewardship programs in emergency rooms. That's a place where a lot of antibiotics are handed out, and then urgent care centers or other target places. So there's a lot of work to do, but I think that probably it's going to take a little bit of carrot and stick to make it actually work, and some better science to know what will not only work, but be sustainable. Because that's the other thing we've observed is that some programs work and you get the numbers down for a while and then they trickle back up. So I think that clearly physicians, other prescribers, all of us have a role, and then every patient has a role. I encourage patients to ask, do I need this antibiotic? If every patient asked that, we'd be a lot further along in the trajectory.
Well, listen, I just want to personally, again, every one of you say thank you for being here. This has been extremely informative to me personally, and I'm glad no one sneezed in here today. And but this has just been great, and your expertise in bringing that here to Congress is very helpful. And Mr. Chairman, to you as well, thank you for calling this hearing and putting this together. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I would like to just follow up on your excellent question. I spent a little time a while ago in Honduras and in Guatemala and in El Salvador, and it was on the immigration issue. But during my visit there, I learned that many of the antibiotics that we use the most popular ones here in the United States, penicillin and others, are available over the counter in those countries. So people don't, they sort of buy them like we buy aspirin. And so, it provides a training ground for some of these germs, and it just reduces the efficacy of those antibiotics. Is there any sort of international or regional cooperation going on with some of those countries where we could work with their health departments and maybe try to educate everyone on our effort here and how they might sort of get on the same page, and maybe we can help them with some of their issues as well?
Huge issue, the over-the-counter availability of antibiotics in much of the world. And I think the plan is the Global Action Plan for Combating Antibiotic Resistance. So it came out of the UN meeting a couple of years ago. And the good news, and the WHO is sort of leading that charge. We're very much committed to and part of that. The good news is that many countries now have an action plan. The challenges are that in many developing countries, access to antibiotics is a much bigger problem than anything else. They have babies dying because they don't have access to antibiotics, and they don't have a healthcare infrastructure to have doctors, nurses, anybody prescribing. So I think it's going to take a lot to change this. Certainly there are efforts in every country as part of this action plan has to have some kind of a stewardship program. It's going to be very different, right? And for some countries it might be taking antibiotics away from over-the-counter status, but it's a huge issue. That access piece globally is very different than what we have here in the United States.
Right, more complicated than I thought. I have a little bit of housekeeping here. I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the California Life Science Association that was offered by Mr. Ruda, right? Without objection, so ordered. Lastly, I'd like to thank you all for your patience and your very, very helpful testimony and the good work that you do on a regular basis in your official capacity. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for you, the witnesses, through the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for responses. And I ask, if you do receive any of these questions, could you please respond as promptly as you are able? With that, this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Watching that BioWatch program.
You've had a long day.
It's just
Catch an interview.